Let me welcome all of you to our BU Jewish Studies graduate student and faculty forum. My name is Michael Zank, and I was invited by Nancy Harris, the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, to welcome our speaker today, who is Myriam Bienenstock from Paris. For those of you who have been part of this community for a little while, Myriam was a visiting professor here not too long ago, and her lectures on Levinas will be well remembered. I know that Alan Spade, who co-invited her at the time, is still waiting for the written version. um, and I'm sure it is forthcoming. Myriam Bienenstock and I have been connected for many years in the study of Hermann Cohen and Franz Rosenzweig, and most recently, Myriam participated remotely, unfortunately, but still actively in our Hermann Cohen workshop last spring. Myriam is retired, but only from teaching at the University of Tours. Otherwise, he's supremely active. Just to share a few recent publications. In 2019, she published L'amour dans le cantique des cantiques, juste une comparaison in Franz Rosenzweig, Judaïsme, Christianisme, Idéalisme, les études philosophiques. That was in 2019. And then also 2019, Subverting Practical Philosophy, Hegel's Science of Spirit, in a volume published by Paulo Diego Bobbio and others, entitled Hegel, Logic and Speculation. She also published in 2019 in Perfektionismus der Autonomie an essay on Neukantianische Antinomie, Hermann Cohen's Beitrag, as well as Dialog und Transzendenz bei Emanuel Levinas in Dialog, ein kooperativer Kommentar. That was in 2020. 2021, she published Aber sie ist leer, es ist nichts darin zu lernen, zur Entstehung der geschichtsphilosophischen Vorlesungen Hegels in Morality, Ethics, Religion, Between Classical German Philosophy and Contemporary Thought, Studies in Honor of Francesca Menegoni. And I could continue like this, because just in the last few years, Myriam has been extremely prolific. She's written about the pantheism controversy, about Jewish Kantianism, about Levinas, Rosenzweig, and of course always Hermann Cohen. She was also recently honored by a Festschrift in her honor, titled Cohen und Rosenzweig. No, sorry, that's the wrong book. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Hermann Cohen, Wege zur Versöhnung, a Festschrift für Myriam Bienenstock that was published in 2018. Again, I could continue, but that would just mean I would take away time from Myriam, and I don't want to do this. So I just want you to help me welcome Myriam back to Boston University.
Thank you very much. And I would like first to thank Professor Nancy Harowitz, the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and then my old-time friend Michael Zank, professor for religious studies at BU and former director of the center, for this beautiful invitation, which honors me all the more because, having been unable to come when it was first made, I received it again, and I can honor it today. It was all the more important for me to come because the subject I wanted to talk about and I would like to talk about today, and on which I have been working for several years now, amongst other things, must be presented not just in old Europe, from which I have just come, but also here in the United States. When I had an opportunity to mention the name of Felix Adler in previous presentations of related issues, those of my listeners who were Americans or American by birth, or more broadly speaking, English speaking, reacted immediately. They knew or had heard about some of his important achievements, particularly in the educational field, about the ethical culture Fieldstone School, for example, which seems to be a renowned world-class progressive educational institution in Manhattan and the Bronx. Felix Adler's name did not elicit the same reactions in Europe, not even in Germany, where a German society for ethical culture, Deutsche Gesellschaft für ethische Kultur, had been founded in Berlin in 1892. It was modeled on the Ethical Culture Society Felix Adler had created in New York in 1876, and it had won the support of many prominent personalities, amongst them that of the famous sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies, who remained faithful to the society until his death. Also that of several neo-Kantians, amongst them Hermann Cohen and Paul Natorp or Karl Vorländer. Contrarily to Tönnies and to many others, Cohen, however, withdrew his support in the first years of the 20th century for reasons which have not yet been clarified. And I'm very keen of presenting before my highly qualified audience of tonight my own reconstruction of his objections to Adler's ethical culture movement, and I'm also very keen to hear your reactions. Since I presume that Felix Adler's name and his achievements are not unknown to you, less than in Europe, I won't come back on them, at least not in detail, but rather put emphasis upon that which is probably less known, also because it seems that relatively few studies have been devoted to it. The German Ethical Culture Society, and more particularly the educational debate, which has served as one of the strongest incentives to create that society. The debate centered upon the question of whether or not a religious instruction, a confessional one, as one said then, should be not merely preserved, but also strengthened in state schools. This is the debate which accounts, in any case, in a large measure, for the eagerness manifested by Hermann Cohen in those years to join the German society. I shall then turn to Cohen's criticism of ethical culture in later years, which seems never to have been examined up to now. One reason being that I am today, I think, in presence of some of the best experts in the field. Another reason being that Cohen's argument seems to me highly relevant today, particularly in the realm of education, in which the question of how to teach ethics in schools has become a burning issue once again. But let me say first a few words on Felix Adler. This well-known American philosopher and social reformer, the son of a Reform rabbi, born in Germany and died in 1933, had encountered Hermann Cohen quite early in his life. When taking part in a Kant reading group, the German Jewish philosopher gathered round him in Berlin in the year 1872. At that time, Cohen was about 30 years old, and he had already begun to make a name for himself in the scholarship on Kant. Felix Adler was 9 years younger and at that time still a student. But it was in those years in Germany that he discovered Friedrich Albert Lange's labor question, a text about which he writes, Felix Adler, in his autobiographical piece, An Ethical Philosophy of Life, that it had proved epoch-making in his life. He writes that he read that text, I quote, with burning cheeks. No work of fiction ever excited me as did this little treatise. It was ethical in spirit, if not in its ruling ideas. It favored productive cooperation and seemed to point the way to immediate action, and socialism did not. This would be then the main thrust of Lange's pamphlet. What is important is not the socialist idea, but the actual implementation. Lange was and always remained a socialist. He also kept close friends among the founding fathers of the German social democracy, and he always remained closer, much closer to them than Hermann Cohen ever was. This was not the case with Felix Adler, who distanced himself from the start from socialist ideas. The thesis he ascribed to Hermann Cohen, also in his Ethical Philosophy of Life, is worth quoting here. Adler says that, according to Hermann Cohen, I quote, if there is to be anything like religion in the world thereafter, socialism must be the expression of it, end quote. And then Adler immediately adds that when he heard that quip, he was not convinced, but he did see some point in it after all. And I quote, I did not agree with his statement that socialism spells religion, and had not seen my way to this day towards identifying the two. But I realized that there was a measure of truth in what he said, and that I must square myself with the issues that socialism raises. Adler declared the socialist ideal, I quote, ethically spurious, because it omits the notion of right and substitutes for it that of power. He also asked, and I quote, whether the run of mankind are capable of cooperative effort on a large scale without the preeminent leadership of masterminds, whether socialism, if carried out, would really breed, as is expected to, the sentiment of ideal brotherhood, whether the sentiment of brotherhood itself, unless it be rooted in the closer family and national ties, is morally sound, whether the emotional forces that sweep through and overwhelm large aggregations of men can be bridled and sufficiently enlightened to promote the ends of socialism. All such questions as these touch the feasibility of the ideal proposed. My own reaction was and is against the ideal itself. Cooperation, Adler said, aims at the same result as socialism by voluntary association instead of by collective compulsion. In his own projects for social reform, which did change over time, he preferred the notion of organization over that of cooperation, but he kept a very close guideline, promoting practical reforms rather than a philosophy or a theory, whatever such a theory may be. For, after all, it is the practice that counts. His famous call, which was put forward as early as 1876, when he founded the New York Society for Ethical Culture, was diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed, a credo which evolved into deed before creed, and then deed, not creed, and led to a rupture, not only with the Jewish reform education he had received, but also with the Hebrew religion in which he had been brought up, and with the American Jewish community. It must, however, be noted that his separation from Judaism, which was gradual, only became public after his return in 1873 from his first trip to Germany. Felix Adler did accept over many years the universalism and the ideal of social ethics of the Hebrew prophets. What he objected to more and more strongly over the years was mainly the particularism of the Jewish religion. But he went on defining the program of his newly founded Society for Ethical Culture, not just as an ethics, but very explicitly as a religion, a practical religion. His endeavor fostered a large number of impressive projects and deeds. Amongst them, only a few can be mentioned here. Foundation in 1877 of the first district nursing service for deprived neighborhoods, in 1878 of the first free kindergartens for working people in New York City. Members of his society fought for instituting laws governing and protecting child labor and for improving housing in slums and poor areas of New York. Adler was not just concerned with overcrowding in these neighborhoods, but also with the increase in contagious disease caused by that overcrowding. And he established in 1885, together with other instances, the tenement house building company, which constructed cheaper housing in New York, mainly in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Felix Adler's achievements were also prompted by a concern manifestly present in him from the outset to combat the degradation of women and fight the discriminations against them. And I quote, "I had always felt an instinctive idealizing reverence for women, and this had its influence in the first practical outcome of the philosophy of life with which I started my career," he writes. You see, for me, Felix Adler's work was a real discovery. The list of his realizations is very long and truly impressive. It also includes an activity in the area of international politics led by pacifism and contributions to the creation in Europe of ethical culture movements similar to his own. Felix Adler seems indeed to have served as an important source of inspiration for the creation in Germany in 1892 of the German Society for Ethical Culture. Since he had been staying in Germany in 1891-92 for a few months, he was invited to give reports on his activity towards setting up and developing in the US a Society for Ethical Culture. He gave such a report on at least 2 occasions in Berlin. When the German Society for Ethical Culture was finally founded there in October 1892, he was already back in the US and did not personally take part in the event, but it was the model offered by his society which served as the basic source of inspiration. So now I turn to that German society. World betterment out of a scientific worldview, Weltverbesserung auf wissenschaftlicher Weltanschauung. This is the heading under which one leading contemporary German political scientist, Hermann Lübbe, replaces the German Ethical Society, Culture Society. It is undoubtedly perspicuous. It is also right to insist with Lübbe that during the second half of the 19th century, several associations with a comparable program were constituted in Germany, and that the DGEK, German Ethical Culture Society, was neither the earliest nor the most important of them. The German Free Thinkers Association of Ludwig Büchner had already been created in 1881, and the one with by far the greatest impact was the German Monists Association, Deutscher Monistenbund, with Ernst Haeckel, the famous biologist who introduced Darwin's theories to Germany as inspiratory and honorary president. Some members of the German Ethical Culture Society also belonged to other associations. For example, Friedrich Jodl, a German Austrian specialist of Feuerbach, who was a member of the Deutscher Monistenbund, in addition to being a co-founder of the German Ethical Society, and many were or became famous. The seat of the society always remained Berlin, but ethical culture societies were founded in many other German cities and German-speaking cities of other countries, Vienna and Zurich. And if its members were mostly academics and relatively few in number, only 2,000 in some years, mainly in Berlin, it developed a wide activity in different areas of life, publishing with the prolific Ethische Kultur, which existed a very long time, lecturing, sending lecturers to different towns, setting up public reading rooms and public libraries, also information centers on welfare care, and endeavoring mainly to intervene in the educational system. For the creation of the German Society for Ethical Culture itself had been motivated by a specific educational issue. A project had been put forward in 1892 by the Prussian Minister of Education, Robert von Zedlitz, which would have made it impossible had it come through to maintain the existing organization in what was called then Simultanschulen, that is interdenominational schools, which existed so far, according to which pupils of different confessions were taught together in the same classes and separately only in classes on religion. The project stipulated, amongst other regulations, that wherever possible, teachers be of the same confession as the majority of their pupils, and employed only once they had passed an examination in which a representative of the ecclesiastical supreme authority with voting rights took part. Furthermore, that new elementary schools should be established only on a denominational basis. And the fear grew, particularly amongst the intelligentsia, that the reform would substantially increase clerical influence in public elementary schools, thereby ultimately transforming them into confessional ones. Heated protests arose, which resulted into the project being withdrawn. A new school bill only came into being much later, in 1906, after debates much more subdued than those of 1892. But it was during these years of 1892-93 that the German Society for Ethical Culture itself was created. A mood of optimism seems to have reigned in those years, which followed Bismarck's removal from power in 1890 and the repeal of the exceptional laws against the socialists. And many were then led to believe that reforms could be envisaged. One even found liberals, particularly amongst the left-oriented ones, who believed that class fraternization was possible also with social democratic groups. Some leading figures of the German Society for Ethical Culture seem indeed to have been quite close to the German Social Democratic Party, and since many amongst the early adherents of to the society were free thinkers or even declared atheists, the society soon earned the reputation of being irreligious, even if it never endorsed atheism officially. Discussing the Zedlitz project in an article entitled Morality, Religion and School, Contemporary Reflections on the Prussian School Law, an article which enjoyed quite a wide reception at the time of its publication, Friedrich Jodl thus engages in a fascinating discussion of the Prussian government's claim that schools imperatively need to include a teaching of ethics in their curriculum, yet cannot possibly teach it without religion. He points out that the practice of teaching ethics without religion already exists, in the first place in France, where a law dated 28th of March 1882, the Loi Jules Ferry, had made elementary education compulsory, while leaving to all parents the options of giving to their children religious instruction or none, thereby making, that's what Jodl says, an immense step out of the Middle Ages. He quotes several French treatises devoted to the presentation of a secular morality, une morale laïque, which he finds excellent. He wonders why these treatises, and with them the whole French debate over laïcité, has remained foreign to Germans. Could this be due to the fact that in centralized France, progress towards the constitution of a universally valid ethics takes its origin in the state, in a political initiative moving from top to bottom, whereas in Germany, and for that matter in England, it advances from bottom upwards in the association of individuals towards the formation of a community. And it is at that point that he informs his readers on the creation in the great cities of America of ethical societies which want to have an impact upon adults as well as upon children by means of the purely ethical teaching, and thereby replace the church community for their members. Die Kirchengemeinschaft ersetzen. But he does not further explicate the meaning of that startling sentence. Adler himself had believed that one could certainly not get any inspiration from German sources in that central educational matter which was at stake. He had explained in lectures which he gave at the School of Applied Ethics in Plymouth, Massachusetts, Plymouth, not far from here, I suppose, in 1891, Plymouth, just before embarking for the US, before embarking for Europe, actually, that, I quote, one of the most notable achievements of the American Commonwealth was to have so distinctly separated between the domain of religion and of politics, whereas no such separation existed in Germany, a country in which schools existed before the state took charge of them, and church and state were united. And I quote, that's Felix Adler. In Germany, the state has actually encroached upon the church, has entered church schools and reconstructed them in its own interest. To adopt the German system in America would be to permit the church to encroach upon the state, to enter state schools and subordinate them to sectarian purposes. The example of Germany cannot, therefore, be quoted as a precedent in point. Adler thus contended that although it was imperative to give a moral instruction to children, such an instruction should be unsectarian, that is, outside the domains of the churches. His lectures were speedily translated into German by one of the co-founders of the German Society for Ethical Culture. But conflicts erupted precisely over that central educational question, and they were never solved. Members went on fighting over the question of an ethical instruction in schools, whether it should be given instead of the traditional religious instruction or alongside it. Let us for once try to make a religion out of ethics. Only out of it, Ferdinand Tönnies, then director of the German Society for Ethical Culture section in Kiel, thus intoned. But others disagreed, amongst them Paul Natorp, who insisted, he was an educator, upon the beneficial effect of faith and of biblical poetical readings upon young minds, arguing that a Christian foundation of the elementary school was and would still be indispensable for Germany. Jodl of the Ethical Culture Society countered that, I quote, one does not find in the religious what is common, but what separates, unquote. Nice quotation. And on that question, a decisive one for the German Society for Ethical Culture, Hermann Cohen, interestingly enough, did not take sides with his neo-Kantian colleague Paul Natorp, but with Jodl. The specific reason for which he rallied the German Society for Ethical Culture immediately with its creation was his intention to join the fight against confessionalism in educational matters. This is confirmed by his introduction with critical postscript to the 5th edition of Lange's History of Materialism and its criticism. In that introduction, which was written just a few years after the creation of the society, it was published for the first time in 1896, Cohen still alludes to the fight over a confessional bill which had led to the creation of the society, and he insists that, I quote, the expression confession harms the principle of autonomy, which should not be allowed to be acknowledged by following a manual of the Confederation, but must be rediscovered in every moment of life, etc., etc. This is the reason for which it is the slogan, resolution of religion into ethics, which counts for ethics as a science. The interest of the individual, which is represented in part by religion, has become the foundational principle of ethics in autonomy. Religion, on the contrary, abandons the principle of the individual by breeding special communities which threaten and annihilate the autonomy of the person. It is Kant whom Cohen praises for having introduced the concept of autonomy in the contemporary discussion of the relation between ethics and religion. But it is not from Kant that he borrows the slogan of a resolution of religion into ethics. Kant never advanced such an idea. Cohen follows Lange, who had resorted to the very term of Auflösung, resolution, in order to write on the page which had left an indelible impression on the young Felix Adler that a new spiritual principle ought to be created, which would contain in itself at one and the same time the resolution, Auflösung, and the accomplishment, Erfüllung, of Christianity. Cohen, like Lange, does not reject religion as such. What he rejects rather is the conflict, Widerstreit of religion with ethics, which already appears, according to him, that is Cohen, in the possibility to talk about religion in the plural. It is such a possibility, he says, which turns religion into the confession and crumbles the unity of humanity into communities of fellow believers. Cohen's foremost objection to that which he calls religion at that time, thus, is its propensity to arouse a plurality of confessions or religious communities. What he rejects is confessionalism, and also manifestly that's which we call today communitarianism, a notion the long-time member of the German Society for Ethical Culture, Ferdinand Tönnies, famously helped to create with his work Community and Society, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. The convinced freethinker and educationalist Rudolf Penzig, who became a general secretary of the German Society in 1893 and editor of the Ethische Kultur, relates in his festive gift to the American Society, because there were very close relations between the German Society and the American one, and it is not known really that how close the relations were already at that time. The Penzig relates that the differences of opinion which developed in the German society on the basic question of a religious education in schools by the churches were so strong that they led to the adoption in 1903 of a new program in which a call for the, I quote, secularization of the state's entire life and of the public school in the first place was issued, and that affiliated societies were created to further the debate, which bore titles like secular school, weltliche Schule, or the League for a Secular School and the Moral Instruction, Bund für weltliche Schule und Moralunterricht. But the predominantly negative attitude of members towards any religious instruction at school led several leading personalities to resign from their positions in the German society because it had become too anti-religious for them, too secular. This was the case of Wilhelm Förster himself, one of the founders, and also that of one of his famous sons, Friedrich Wilhelm Förster, who after 1900 leaned more towards Catholicism. The hypothesis that Hermann Cohen stopped participating to the society's activities precisely in those years for very similar reasons seems, in that case, quite likely. In the criticism of ethical culture, which he develops both in his introduction to the ethics of pure will, which is from 1904, and which has now been translated into English, and in an article entitled The Edification of Chairs for Ethics and Philosophy of Religion in Jewish Theological Institutions, which was published the same year in one of the leading reviews for Jewish affairs, the Monatsschrift für Geschichte und Wissenschaft des Judentums. Cohen strongly emphasizes the major contribution of Hebrew prophetism to ethics. He reiterates his basic conviction that modern religiosity has set its center of gravity in ethics, and he deplores that the essential contribution of Judaism to ethics has remained unacknowledged. He also adds that as long as one merely highlights the ethical teachings of Judaism, it will be impossible to properly appreciate its significance. And then he calls for instituting a teaching of Judaism centered on theology and the philosophy of religion in German institutions of Jewish learning. It is precisely in such a context that he criticizes ethical culture. Its fundamental mistake, der grundsätzliche Fehler, would be not to have understood that the science of ethics will remain a truncated body as long as one detaches from it the concept of God. The temptation is great to relate that argument to Adler's glaring omission. That was a well-known anecdote. He omitted any reference to God in the temple sermons in 1873, which marked his return to America after his first visit to Germany. That incident had soon become famous, and if equals of it reached Cohen, which is probable, they would have strengthened his displeasure about Adler's behavior towards Judaism. But such a displeasure had most probably developed many years before it was explicitly formulated in 1904. And it cannot be reduced to Adler's treatment of the Jewish God in his temple sermon, or even for that matter, to Adler's rejection of any and every religious particularism, the Jewish one included. For one of Cohen's basic lifelong struggles had consisted in trying to convince his contemporaries that the basic ethical command to love one's neighbor, which stems from the Hebrew Bible, cannot be understood in a particularistic way, if only because of the prescription to love the stranger as yourself, which also stems from the Hebrew Bible. The thesis according to which universality is a distinctive, indispensable mark of ethics can also be found reinforced in the ethics of pure will. Adler agreed. He puts it like that in his ethical philosophy of life. Morality is either universal or nothing. This had always been Cohen's teaching. And even if the anti-Semitic agitation in Europe led Cohen to intervene much more often and forcefully than Adler on behalf of the German Jewish community, Cohen did maintain up to the end of his life his non-particularistic, universalistic reading of the Hebrew Bible. He must have known that Adler had accepted his reading and that he too had wanted to fight religious particularism. One should also add that Cohen had already developed those theses in the first version of his introduction to Lange, which was published in 1896, when he still adhered to the German Society for Ethical Culture, etc., etc. And then he had pointed out that the idea of God should be understood as an idea in the Kantian sense of the term, not mythologically. Many of these theses, and the thesis he directs later on against ethical culture, actually express nothing else than his neo-Kantian convictions, and I am not going to put emphasis on that. When he had decided to adhere to the German Society, he had nonetheless showed himself ready to pass over the different convictions, even Darwinistic one, of many of its members, because the main reason for which he had adhered to ethical culture had not been philosophical. It could well be the case that the reason for which he stopped participating in that society was not philosophical either, even if it is with philosophical reasons that he begins in his ethics of pure will. His reversal could have been related to the alarming rise in Germany in those years of anti-Semitism. For the growth of anti-Semitism always remained one of his nagging concerns. But I have, in any case, the German society had always been unequivocal in its plea against anti-Semitism and for religious tolerance, and I did not find any sign of a change on that question in the position of the society. Cohen could at most have feared that by refraining from explicitly mentioning the Jewish contribution to ethics, ethical culture would contribute, if only nolens volens, to the strengthening of anti-Semitism. What must be taken into account is that Cohen was much better acquainted with what happened in Germany than with developments in the US or in other countries. And even if his criticism is directed against ethical culture as a whole, and thereby also against Felix Adler, to whose name he associated ethical culture as a matter of course, it makes sense to argue that it must have been the evolution of the German society which he bewailed in the first place. He had certainly noticed its metamorphosis into a society which functioned as a kind of ersatz of the more traditional religions. The German ethical society seems to have organized Sunday sermons instead of the Christian ones, during which religious and moral ideals, also social ones, were discussed, and then there was a secular pastoral care, eine weltliche Seelsorge, and name celebrations instead of baptism, and wedding and funeral ceremonies, all these to replace religion. Cohen certainly disapproved. One cannot simply invent a new religion, even one which would be centered upon ethics. Culture, he thus writes in the Ethics of Pure Will, has worked for millennia, theoretically and in practice. Religion has worked towards elaborating something ethical. Instead of referring to a so-called ethical culture, one should rather refer to a culture of ethics, and religion is included in such a process. It also belongs to culture. But I think that the main argument, this is my contention, that the main argument Cohen raises against ethical culture appears somewhat later in his introduction to the Ethics of Pure Will. Ethical culture, he writes, takes it for granted that, I quote, what is ethical depends on the individual, and it thereby diverts from the problem of the totality or Allheit. Indeed, he explains, ethical culture, and I quote, confronts religion for the purpose of eradicating the exclusivity to which religion falls prey. It is so consistent that it also confronts one-sidedness in politics. It is nevertheless active outside the political arena. Unavoidably, then, it is marginalized as a religious sect. Whenever ethics is taken up as an issue outside the realm of politics, it inevitably lands in the confines of the cloister, no matter how hostile the attitude towards religious dogma. I think that this is Cohen's strongest criticism of ethical culture. The movement remained without any declared political dimension. And this proved to be his essential weakness. Instead of succeeding in eradicating the exclusiveness of religion in line with its initial purpose, it turned unavoidably into yet another religious sect. Cohen did not share the tendency of many of his contemporaries to restrict themselves to problems of the philosophy of science and to stay away from political life. He himself always dealt with political theory, and we know that he identified himself as a socialist, even if he distanced himself from the German founders of the political party socialism, and he developed what is known as ethical socialism. But this is a tendency which is which he shared with somehow Felix Adler. One question, the influence of Hermann Cohen's conception of ethical socialism on the ethical culture movement is rarely taken into account, mainly because Felix Adler, who was himself a recognized Kant scholar, had always consistently rejected the socialist ideal. But actually, on those matters, there was they both agreed. There was an agreement between Adler and Cohen. Adler marked his agreement with the basic cooperative aim of socialism, but explicitly rejected the collective compulsion required by this political movement. And I'm not going to tell you about all that, but I want to get to the main, the conclusion, which is one of the main points. I think that one of the best ways to clarify the meaning of Cohen's criticism of ethical culture is to consider its implications for the field of education, because educational issues had stood at the start and probably even at the center of the ethical culture society, and they had played a major role in Cohen's decision to join the association. It thus is particularly significant to note that Cohen always considered a non-confessional education for all future citizens, Jewish ones included, as an imperative. He advocated this position from the start and preserved it throughout his life, also in 1904, when he issued a call for the institution of specifically Jewish theological studies in institutions of higher learning. And we note that the call only concerned institutions of higher learning, not schools on the level of elementary school, on the elementary level, which had to remain non-confessional. Cohen is emphatic about this point in The Ethics of Pure Will. Compulsory education for all, the allgemeine Schulpflicht, he writes there, is the cornerstone of the modern state. It is the state, not the church, which must care for the formation of its future citizens, because it alone, the state, is the place of growth of ethical self-consciousness. I think that it may well have been this position rather than a disagreement on the issue of socialism or on the Jewish religion, which fundamentally accounts for Cohen's criticism of ethical culture. But I want to say another word, in conclusion to this lecture, and that is that the position adopted by Franz Rosenzweig here is exactly the same as that of Cohen. In any case, on the face of it, Franz Rosenzweig who at the end of his life in 1918, after World War I, considered himself primarily as an educator, wrote two major articles which belong together on educational matters. The most well-known one is a project on Jewish education entitled Zeit ist es, it is time, which calls for the creation in Germany of specifically Jewish theological studies in dedicated institutions of higher learning, and which won Cohen's warm approval. But Rosenzweig also wrote at the same time another project, which was entitled Volksschule und Reichsschule. That is, how would you translate that? Volksschule, it's the elementary school, huh? Yeah, and Reichsschule and the empire, the school of the empire, or whatever. Volksschule und Reichsschule. And that other project was supposed to serve as the foundation of the project of Jewish education, as the foundation of the project of Jewish education. And in that project, he strongly insisted upon, I quote, the idea of the unitary national formation, die Idee der nationalen Einheitsbildung for all schools. And I quote, I may be wrong about everything in particular, Rosenzweig wrote, but this main point I would always continue to champion if I could stand up for the cause personally. End of quote. He adds that because nobody asked him about education in Germany at the time. Both authors, in any case, Rosenzweig and Cohen, seem to adopt exactly the same position, in any case on the face of it, for the agreement could well conceal deep-seated differences to begin with on the political level. Rosenzweig never adhered to socialism and certainly did not defend the same conception of the state as Cohen. However, educational issues are more likely than any other ones to illuminate the issues at stake in Cohen's debate with Felix Adler. They also highlight the relevance of their debate up to this day. That's it. And thank you for your attention. It was a bit long.
We have time for questions. We even have microphones.
Myriam, thank you. That was very interesting. And I have a number of questions, but I guess the place I wanted to start was with the relation between Cohen's sense of Schulpflicht, right, and the larger aims of adult education, sort of personal Bildung and so forth that attach to the ethical culture movement. What happens between Schulpflicht, which pertains to kids and so forth? What happens between, in his view, between that and the larger enterprises associated with ethical culture and adult formation and so forth? Could you fill in that picture a little bit for me? This is really informational, a really informational question.
For adult education?
Yes.
Well, I think he thought that the main point was for children, because this is what decides about the future, not adult education. That's why I don't know were there so many institutions for adult education at the time. Maybe that's something which is more contemporary, isn't it? I don't know. I don't know.
I guess it's important for that notion of, I guess really a further question for me is just the significance of culture, right? And in German, it's ethische Kultur, right?
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and not
Yeah.
sittliche Bildung or
No.
yeah.
No.
So I guess the question is what, are there larger aims beyond just formation for children in that, or
Well, that was
yeah.
Beyond that. Then one must look at all those aims they had, which I quoted. That is, yes, they built all kinds of things. That is, libraries, and they sent lecturers to different towns to and also for popular circles. Yes, that's they did that also in Germany, but not just in the States. But that was mainly in the States that it was that Felix Adler developed that strongly, actually. What was impressive was their creation of public libraries at the time in Germany that didn't exist. And they were the ones who created that in different towns, which I find quite impressive. And then they sent lecturers in different towns, to different towns, and who gave lectures to also to different circles. But I think that was less developed than in the US. Well, I don't know about the US, but I think that was the case, actually. And they had this, in that yes, in that sense, they had an interesting impact, actually. But I think in Germany it was less developed than here, as far as
Other comments, questions? It's not easy to enter into this conversation because of the very detailed account of two societies in two different places with different systems of education, and but I appreciate the question, and I hope we'll work this out a little more.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. As you were speaking, I had an eerie sense of a deja vu for 200 years previously in England, where the deists were just starting to develop a departicularized ethical monotheism without revelation. And it went in two different directions. As you know, on the one hand, the departicularizing aspect leads to anti-Semitism in Voltaire and Shaftesbury, because as deists, they don't like the doctrinaire part of Orthodox Judaism. But on the other hand, it does lead to a kind of ethical universalism, that, as you were describing, which becomes quite secular. So you mentioned the Kantian, the pre-Kantian aspect, but I'm just wondering whether there was any recognition when they were developing these ethical societies, cultures for ethical improvement, whether there was a deist inheritance in that effort.
So whether there was a what?
In the story you just told,
Yeah.
focused on a German-American nexus. Just wondering if there's a recognition of a problem that predates this particular controversy that you're talking about.
Well, all the debates on 18th century debates, actually, on deism. Yeah, well, I don't know about, I don't think there was on this specific, the creation of these specific societies in Germany. I don't think there was an influence. No, I don't think so. They were much more inclined much more inclined towards not towards deism, but towards Darwinian conceptions. That was the main. I think many of those who took part in those circles were actually well.
Ethical culture movement than, for instance, the Catholics, because in Germany and England and France, I mean, you do have liberalizing Protestant sects such as the Quietists, the Quakers, the Unitarians that are trying to develop a theology that's basically ethics without a strong emphasis on particular revelations. So when this movement gets going in Germany,
it's the whole history of the Aufklärung, of the Enlightenment in Germany, which one should go back to in that case. So there was, of course, well, they knew about that, but that's an older story. That's a much older story. So I don't think there was the strongest influence for those ethical societies in Germany, actually, and even in the States. I think that was Darwin and Darwinian conceptions. That was, and it was much later than Aufklärung, etc. That was related to them somehow.
But couldn't one argue that it was indeed, in a very general sense, the 18th century itself and its universalism, its extreme contrast to what was earlier, that maybe through Darwinism or not, I don't know, but surely the universalism, as I understand you, was very clear in Adler and Cohen. And in fact, of a large part of the distinction they wished to draw between the American case and the German case. So maybe the universalism is in such an amorphous state that we hardly recognize its presence. But I would argue, if I've understood your lecture correctly, that indeed one of the lineage of the universalism in Cohen and Adler came from Voltaire, even from the 18th century.
Voltaire, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe, but I think what the difference between the main difference, as I see it, the major difference between what happened in the US and what happened actually in Germany, and for that matter in France, had to do with the role of the state as against communities, different communities. So coming from below or coming from above, actually, the national state in France, and somehow in that case also in Germany, whereas in the States, well, religion was built upon communities somehow from below, and well, it was not imposed from above, actually. That's one of the basic differences, and the universalism is the universalism of a state, actually. What does it mean, universalism? It's universalism against different particular communities. And it's the universalism of a state which imposes, which gives a law. It's maybe the notion of a law. Where does the law come from? And that's one of the differences, I would say, between a conception like that of Felix Adler and that of Hermann Cohen, who always put much emphasis upon the state. Why? Because of the laws the state was imposing to different communities somehow. That's the universalism. It's not an abstract and amorphous universalism, but it's a universalism of a law which is the same for everybody somehow.
And that was carried very significantly by the state, the Bill of Rights,
Yes.
the American Constitution. It's right on John Locke, who preached the doctrine of universalism. But in the United States case, unlike in Europe, the universalism in the U.S. had a very strong, as Max Weber would say, social carrier group, namely Protestantism and the Protestant sect, which took God's laws in the most literal sense, namely that we are in his eyes equal before him, and we are his children. That's a big push towards universalism if it's ever taken seriously. And in the U.S. case, the sect, the Protestant sect, actually did take it seriously.
Myriam, one thing I think it might be of interest to you, just to say about libraries, as someone who likes libraries, I think it was Carnegie in the United States who made a crusade of going out and spending his fortune on public libraries. There was no similar financial philanthropic force in Germany or France until much later. So Carnegie, for all of his crimes, deserves a lot of credit in America.
In America.
The second thing, I want to ask a question I don't know the answer to, and that is the discussion between Cohen and Adler essentially turned on issues that had already been debated for centuries since Spinoza. So Spinoza's Tractatus already set out religion without revelation and universalist religion and reason, which he took to be the science of his day from Descartes. Was Adler reading Spinoza? Is there any evidence? Because later on, Cohen is very critical of Spinoza. He doesn't like Spinoza at all, and he calls him all kinds of unpleasant names. So I just wonder where Spinoza might fit in to this triangulation of important ideas going on in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century.
Well, I don't think that Spinoza was an interpretation of Spinoza. What was at stake in that debate between the two, between Felix Adler and Hermann Cohen. And I don't think that the subject of revelation, whether there is religion is founded on revelation or not, was important in this precise debate. Actually, it was, but not in that debate. In that debate, it was more. Actually, it was the question of communitarianism, the question of religious communities, which are by essence, according to Hermann Cohen, actually, religious communities are closed upon themselves, are particularistic, and in a state where there are several religions, then how do you fit them together, actually? And how can they agree? And that's it's because of that basic question that he thought, Hermann Cohen, that there should be the same law which decides on in primary schools, the same education in primary schools all children, independently of their different religions. That it can't work without a common, actually, a common primary education for everybody, independently of their religion. I think that's the main debate here, which is at stake, which is important somehow. How are you building primary education for children? It can't be, you can't have private schools, so to speak. That's for elementary, private elementary schools, which are different for one religion and for another one. And I think that's that's what is relevant in the whole debate. That's the point. Somehow.
It's interesting to me that you started your conversation about Felix Adler and who he is and what he did as something that resonated with an American audience or American cultured people. And I think some of the difficulties we encounter now is that actually your plaidoyer for Cohen's position is very much grounded in the German political sphere. That is where education is state-sponsored and where the state mediates between different communitarian associations, and where then the Society for Ethical Culture seems to have to be seem to Cohen to deteriorate into just another communitarian association and failing to see the political mandate of ethics. But it's really for Americans, I think this is very opaque. Because this is not your system. This is not the way you think about education. The last sentence that you just added, that is private schools cannot do a good job in mediating little children towards a common good, is completely alien and foreign to American society. It's exactly the opposite here. So I think that's part of the difficulty that you encounter. That is, there's actually an ongoing debate. There's an ongoing problem that is grounded in these two very, very different systems. By the way, I'm speaking into the microphone because we are being recorded. So if you were to speak, please, into the microphone.
No, it's true that I think the model is very different. By the way, it's not only a German one. Basically, for me, it's the French model, which is even older than the German one. and private schools, what does it mean to have private schools, you see? And that's, it's possible that, well, I don't know the American, it seems that I do not know and do not understand the American system of private primary schools or private schools somehow, which is so completely different. So that's the problem. Yeah.
May I offer an anecdote? Well, actually, it's not an anecdote. It's a lesson. When the American troops after World War II occupied Germany, the troops and their accompanying scholars threw out the German three-track system. This occurred around 1950, 51, 52, 53. They threw out the three-track system, which made a distinction at age 10, whether the child would go on a track towards the university or on a track towards becoming a bookkeeper or a bank teller or on a track towards becoming an electrician or a plumber. The Americans found that completely reprehensible because it did not offer opportunity. It tracked people rigidly, and those who attended the second or third track did not have access to universities.
Well, that's still the case in the German educational system. That wasn't changed. I went through that system. I know it.
It is.
It was never touched.
Yeah.
The Americans, when the Americans left
what was that, 56, 57 or so, the Germans switched back immediately to their three-track system, which they have to this day. So it's not easy to move from one called particularism and the other called universalism.
Well, it's universalism in that restricted sense, actually. But it's true that I'll have to learn more about the American system. I don't understand that. It seems, huh?
Yes, Nancy.
I have a completely different kind of question, but I've been really fascinated reading about Felix Adler and the lecture he gave at Temple Emmanuel in New York, when he talked about the future of Judaism and didn't use the word God and offended everybody so much he was never invited back. His father, Samuel Adler, correct, who is one of the founders of the Reform movement, I'm just wondering what their relationship was and imagining the conversations at the dinner table, perhaps?
The conversation with the father. No, it was very progressive, I think. I mean, it was the community of the father which didn't like the sermon of Felix Adler. The father, I think he hoped at the time that he would convince his son, etc. And he didn't see it in such a bad light, but the community didn't like the sermon somehow. Well,
I have a different comment. And so Felix Adler was a German Jew, basically by affiliation, by education, and by class, I would imagine. And that might have also accounted for the fact that he was anti-socialist. Because at the same time as you have the Society for Ethical Culture, you have many, many socialist initiatives, union building,
yes.
all those things happening in New York. So can you speak to that kind of German acculturation and the kind of classist assumptions that went into it?
Well, he was a...
Speaking here as a socialist, though. As a German socialist.
No, he basically the thing he had against socialism was the state. Again, the political socialism he didn't like, and then what ethical socialism for him was, it was it was Kant. It was the main source of his conception was Kantianism and dignity of the human being. All human beings should be, every human being should be considered as an end in itself and not just as a means, and that's not only, never only as a means. That was his socialism, as the just like the socialism of Hermann Cohen, actually. That was the basic idea of the socialistic idea, was that idea of human dignity, and the same one. And in that sense, so to speak, brotherhood or fraternity, but not more than that. And I think he had that idea of cooperation, which he tried to develop in institutions in New York, in different institutions in New York, and which came directly from that cultural background somehow. So whether that is enough for defining socialism is another question. I think there are many debates, which you know, on ethical socialism and on Hermann Cohen's impact upon socialism in Germany, and whether this is enough to define socialism. They consider human beings as ends in themselves and not never only as means, etc. Is a long discussion which you find in many circles, but not so much in relation to Felix Adler, because he rejected any the very title of socialism. You know, he didn't want to hear about it, but he, well, that famous sentence I quoted about, well, in the other, if there is a religion in the other world, you know, it will be a socialistic one. It was only because of that. Consider the human being as an end in himself, and that's something which might very well have come directly from Cohen, actually. But it has very little to do with Marx and whatever, and political.
Well, if there are no more burning questions, then I would like to thank Myriam Bienenstock for this talk, and thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.